So this is going to be a big story, and I'm going to need you guys to bear with me as I tell this one. Not too long ago, a fighter by the name of Bryce Mitchell came onto a podcast and said some not so politically correct things involving a certain type of people and what this certain type of people may or may not have done at a certain time. I'm not going to go into too much details about what he said. I'm going to more so talk about the repercussions. I'm not going to go into the details because of what YouTube may do to me if I do. So, we're going to keep it real light in terms of what Bryce said. And we're going to go more heavy into the reaction and the consequences and just everything that has happened after Bryce saying this. So, there's a podcast, I think it's called the Jackson Podcast. I've seen it for some while on Twitter. I see their podcast. They bring on fighters. They talk about different shit. I get it. It's whatever. They have like these chains they sell on the podcast too. It's some stupid stuff. It's pretty stupid. But there's a lot of different stupid things these days. So I think Rampage Jackson headlines the podcast, if I'm not mistaken. Maybe another MMA talker or something. But they invited Bryce Mitchell on the podcast only to tell Bryce that, Bryce doesn't have a platform to say what he said and he shouldn't be saying it or whatever. I guess they only brought Bryce on to confront him. So that happened. I didn't watch the video, but I've read about it. And then Anthony Lionheart Smith, a UFC name in the light heavyweight division, has his own podcast, and he went on his podcast to comment what happened on Rampage Jackson's podcast involving Bryce Mitchell. Anthony Smith said that Rampage is wrong for doing that, for inviting Bryce on his podcast to only tell him off without giving Bryce a chance to say anything. And that's really it. So bottom line, I agree. I agree with Anthony Smith. I would take Anthony Smith's side because it doesn't make sense. If Bryce came on, said some really stupid shit on his own podcast, why would you invite him on your podcast to virtue signal? It doesn't make sense. The better thing to do would be to hop on your own podcast, say what you have to say without Bryce in your vicinity. Because Bryce really shouldn't be there. You're giving Bryce, it's not even that. You're not giving Bryce anything. You're just using Bryce. You're using Bryce to look good yourself. And I get it. Bryce should be told off. Bryce should be confronted about this. I don't think Bryce should be fucking executed or arrested for it because it's America. I don't agree with what Bryce said. I don't think what Bryce said should be something that people look up to or promote because I think it is hateful. And it is kind of small-minded, when you consider a whole group of people. So, that being said, I still wouldn't invite Bryce to my own show or podcast, just to invite him on and yell at him and tell him off, and just to make myself look like a fucking white knight or some shit like that. It doesn't make sense. So I agree with Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith said it was pointless, and it's just basically a bad move by Rampage Jackson and the other speakers on the Jackson podcast. I don't even know if I'm saying their podcast correctly. I don't really give a fuck. I don't really watch anybody's podcasts. So, but this type of MMA news has been making circles. A lot of people have been talking about it, and I think it's interesting enough for me to bring up as well. But Rampage Jackson also made a response to Anthony Smith's podcast about saying what happened on Rampage Jackson's podcast. That's a whole fucking confusing thing. That's a whole fucking confusing ass game of telephone. But still, Rampage responded and went at Anthony, called Anthony stupid or some shit like that. I don't know what he said. Bottom line, I think the main takeaway is that virtue signaling is not the best thing to do. If you wanna, if you want to, counter what Bryce said and respond, that is great, and by all means, it should be encouraged. as long as it's you yourself coming onto your own podcast apart from Bryce Mitchell, responding to Bryce Mitchell. I don't think you need to bring Bryce Mitchell on to then create some form of response. I think you could just respond yourself at your own time without involving the guy who said the stupid shit to begin with. You know, because at the same time, while like I said, it's also important to counter Bryce Mitchell and like combat the hateful things that Bryce Mitchell said. I don't think it's necessarily right to bring Bryce Mitchell on, and while even though you didn't let Bryce Mitchell speak, it's still not even fucking cool to have Bryce Mitchell on to just give him the satisfaction or at least the experience of being televised or put on your platform. I don't think you need to necessarily involve Bryce Mitchell himself on your platform. I think you only need to involve his takes to criticize, combat, and just counter, just to counter his takes, not the guy, not the man himself. That's all. Rampage has taken it to the next level. I think he's like really going in on Anthony Smith. I'm not the biggest Anthony Smith fan. This is just my take on the situation. Neither am I a Rampage Jackson fan, to be honest, as well. These are two pretty much older fighters. That a lot of these older fighters are starting to make podcasts and stuff like that, which is fine. Not hating on that at all. I'm just saying that again, Rampage Jackson I think is in the wrong here, and I think it's just important for people to fucking learn from the shit they say or do, without it trying to get too fucking deep into some sort of war or street fight or some shit like that. But yeah, I think Anthony Smith is in the right. I don't think it needs to be dragged on. I think Bryce Mitchell said some stupid shit, and Bryce needs to go on and deal with it by himself, far away from other people. And I think other fighters, if they want to comment on what Bryce said, should do it on their own without getting too close to Bryce Mitchell, which is what Rampage Jackson did, and that's why I believe Rampage is in the wrong. But overall, you let me know what you think. Make sure you like, comment, and subscribe. But most importantly, subscribe. I love you guys, and I'll see you all in the next.